Hello everyone, my name is TJ. I'm the Education Manager at the Old North Church and Historic Site, and welcome to the inaugural video of 99% Sure, where we are sharing some of our favorite facts about the history of Old North. So for our first video, let's start with a pretty basic question about the church. Who held the lanterns in Old North Steeple on the night of Paul Revere's ride? Well, it turns out the answer to this is more complex than you might think. So an extremely brief recap here for the sake of time. Boston needed to let the rest of the colony's militia know when the British Army was on the move and where they were going. Messengers were sent, including Revere, but days earlier, Revere came up with another plan to use the Old North Church, at that time the tallest point in Boston, to help. This way, if the messengers out of Boston were arrested or otherwise delayed, word could still get out. And so, on April 18th, 1775, 2 lanterns were briefly held from Old North Steeple, the famous 1 if by land, 2 if by sea signal. There's way more to this than that. The how, the why of all of that is much more interesting than that brief recap. But back to our original question, who took the lanterns up to the steeple that night? Well, what do we know about this? For one, the signal lanterns were a thing and were seen because Revere's account and other people who saw them say as much. Secondly, we know it was not Revere who held the lanterns. This is according to his own account. And lastly, we also know that nobody ever came forward publicly to admit to doing it. That's it. Not a whole lot to work on with there. We've narrowed it down to not Revere and probably not a British soldier. So let's start with Revere. What does he specifically say about Old North and the lanterns? Well, not a whole lot. All that he ever said was that he, quote, called upon a friend and desired him to make the signal. Beyond that, he only says about the lanterns that he planned this with others ahead of time. There are a few reasons he's so vague that we don't have a ton of time to get into here, but part of it may be Revere trying to keep the identity a secret. For his own part, at least, even 20 years later, Revere signed his own account of the event as a Son of Liberty and wrote, "Do not print my name" next to it, a request which was oddly ignored at the time. So next I'll add that Longfellow's famous poem, Paul Revere's Ride, isn't going to help us either. He changed a lot of the history for artistic reasons, and he too only describes this person as Revere's friend. But over time, some names have been put forward, primarily via the descendants of these people. So first, there was an argument for the church's sexton, Robert Newman. This may have been local neighborhood consensus up to this point anyway. According to the theory, many in the North End always just assumed it was him. And Newman does make sense. He knew the building in and out, being a sexton or the caretaker of the building. He possessed the keys to the building and in fact was arrested soon after by the British Army for this reason, though released for lack of evidence. He probably had motive as well. His family had British officers quartered in their home, a big sticking point for Bostonians leading up to the war. But there is a competing claim, and that it was actually another member of the church, John Pulling Jr., who helped Revere. Pulling also makes sense. Foremost, Pulling and Revere knew each other well. That would make Revere's choice of the phrase "called upon a friend" compelling. Pulling may have had motive himself. There's evidence that Pulling had been involved with the Sons of Liberty. Those who support Pulling also claim that it was always known to have been him, like Newman's fans. And Pulling was also a vestryman, so a higher up in the church. In fact, the story goes that Newman, to get out of being arrested, would claim he didn't have the keys. Pulling had asked for them that night. Pulling also snuck out of Boston shortly after Revere's ride. He didn't seem thrilled about sticking around. Now, there's also a third person named Thomas Barnard who sometimes comes up, sometimes Bernard or Barnard. No offense meant to the Barnard fans out there, but I'm not really sure where the idea of Barnard came from in all this. But most accounts that bring him up at all assume he stood guard at the door. If you really want to stir things up, start a theory that he did it all, but it's complicated enough to begin with. But today, there is an alternative option, and it's not Barnard, but it's that it was Newman and Pulling. Historian David Hackett Fisher, in his book Paul Revere's Ride, argued very convincingly for this. In a lot of ways, the same reasoning for one individual applies to both. There were 2 lanterns after all, and it's a difficult climb up the ladders of the steeple when your hands are full. Both were viewed with suspicion by the British Army, which says a lot. Pulling was an associate of Revere, but Newman had the keys. The rationale behind each separately is very plausible, so why not both? So in short, this entire history has some major complications to it. We always bump up against the problem that few accounts of the lanterns survive from the time period, and no records have been found about the night from the two likely suspects. There's also a worry of bias here. Much of our information comes from the two families involved, and you'll never guess which side they choose. By the way, this debate can sometimes get pretty heated. I've come across a number of quasi-insults and burns in the records here, at least as far as 19th century burns go. But the family and neighborhood lore is still workable, we just need to be careful using it. For such an iconic moment, it's surprising how little there is to go on. This tends to happen a lot in history, but historians can use the circumstantial evidence to say with some certainty here. And when we cross-reference it all, it seems pretty overwhelmingly in favor of Newman and Poling working together with an assist from Barnard. Even something this basic to our story, it turns out, is much more complicated than it would seem. Thanks for joining us for this. If you'd like to support more videos or the Old North in general, we have a link in the description to where you can donate. If you can't, there are other ways you can help. Share this video with your friends or visit our website and history blog to learn more interesting history. Just spreading the word and learning more helps with Old North's mission. And thanks again for watching.